Okay, you sort of touched upon spirituality earlier, and we've come to this sort of words that have similar meanings, and the breath of life, and this. What's your definition of spirituality in regard to breath, then?
Well, I take very literally and very seriously this idea that spirituality and the word spirit, the first of the Greek word pneuma, for example, in the Bible, that it was translated in all the Bibles as spirit. I think that's a huge problem, and I would suggest that all Bibles should be retranslated mostly, and every time they, in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, where Jesus is speaking, I would say that the word pneuma should be translated as breath. And then that was translated to the Latin Bible Vulgate, where still there was the word pneuma was translated to spiritus. And that word spiritus, of course, then meant breath, and it meant spirit, how we then understand it now. And that came from the Latin verb spirare, which means to breathe. So all the spiritual practices and what is called a spirituality, when we talk about spiritual practices, for example, you mentioned before we started to record this that you have practiced aikido. And aikido, of course, has been understood as a spiritual practice in a certain way. And in aikido, for example, the breath is extremely important. And the word ki there can be understood as breath in a certain sense. So the thing I would say that my understanding of spirituality is that everything can become a spiritual practice if that practice, where there is a certain kind of movement or a certain kind of way of doing things, is always following the breath. Because normally what we do, our breath is following, for example, in athletics, the runner or the running makes it, and then the breath becomes panting and becomes faster and so on. So in a spiritual practice, whatever you are doing, it is the breath that you are listening all the time, and all the movements are following and in accordance with the breath. And that would then make a certain practice or exercise spiritual, in my view, if the word spiritual practice is really taken seriously in its original meaning.
Wonderful. I'm just sort of working my way through sort of, Holy Spirit and things like this, lots of translations and things. So, yeah, I mean, people often ask me what I would regard as an embodiment practice. And I say, well, is there body awareness and is there breath? Often they're the things that I point to just immediately. It's kind of as requirements. Okay. What do you think most people are missing about the breath in not thinking about it philosophically, not going as deeply into it as you have? I mean, what are some of the sort of things that you think people are missing that are, to you, maybe now obvious?
Well, they are missing that breath is connected to everything we do. We are normally connected to some of the things that we do. For example, if we do yoga or aikido or some other spiritual practices or martial arts or stuff like this. But I would say that there is actually a respiratory meaning in everything that we do, even for those things that we never connect with the breath. Because how I claim this, or how I try to argue this, is that if you hold your nose and you hold your breath and you start to hold it and you try to do anything that you do in your normal life, whatever that is, and you try to do it by holding your breath and see what happens, how fast it becomes totally meaningless what you're actually doing, because the only thing you're thinking is how I could breathe again. I'm starting to feel really dreadful and anxious and so on. So that means that there is some kind of secret respiratory meaning in everything that we do, even if we don't connect it ever with the breath. And that's kind of part of my philosophy of breathing, is to start to think what could be those secret meanings.
Yeah, I would say about the body more generally. People sometimes say to me, well, how's the body involved? And I'm like, well, if you do this with your body, it's going to change it. If you can optimize your thinking, your social interaction, your expression, it's involved with everything you do. You know, wherever you go, your body's there. It's impacting things. It's just a matter of, do you know if it's happening? Can you control it? Can you influence it? Or is it happening to you without you knowing it? You know, I'm wondering what, you know, what the breath pattern was like of every single philosopher. You know, I'm imagining Nietzsche, you know, having this like crazy ragged breath pattern, or, you know, I'm imagining sort of Socrates having a, you know, having his kind of long out breath, kind of easygoing or whatever. Like, it would be kind of a fun thing to sort of imagine the breath patterns of all these different thinkers who thought that their thinking was independent of their bodies.
I think that would be absolutely fascinating. And nowadays it would be also important to little bit be following what kind of breathing patterns these current philosophers have, and to start to think that could we see perhaps something why they emphasize certain questions because of their breath. And
nice. Do I want to be that way as well, right? Like, if your philosophy is embodied in manner X, do I want to take on your philosophy by the fruits of it that are being shown in your breath? Sometimes maybe not, you know. Sometimes I kind of see people and go, wow, that's your embodiment. Whatever you're thinking, I don't want it in my head, you know. Like,
exactly,
like there's a sign that's being given to me of like, maybe keep away from this guy, you know, before I hear one word of their philosophy.
That's exactly, Mark. So the thing is, like, what in this anthology that we wrote called Atmospheres of Breathing, one of the key points in our introduction is that we take the Nobel Prize winner of literature, Elias Canetti's, this aphorism, very seriously and start to think what it means, because he says that it is not enough to think, one also has to breathe. And then comes the important sentence: dangerous are the thinkers who have not breathed enough.
Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? Yeah, it's definitely a sign for me if people, and I'm not expecting people to be athletic, for example, but I want to see a vibrancy. I want to hear a kindness in their breath, you know, not like Darth Vader breathing. That's, you know, this kind of thing. It's like, as soon as you hear Darth Vader, you know he's a bad guy from the breath, right? It's like, come on, pay attention. This is obvious.
Well, yeah, and when you said this, like, for example, if everybody starts to walk in this kind of COVID masks all the time, will it start to make us a little bit like Darth Vader as well? That's a kind of a question which I think is worth of thinking.
Worth thinking about, for sure. Worth thinking about it. I'm imagining this really blows the minds of philosophy students. If you were doing a lecture at a university and you're like, okay, how does Heidegger breathe? No one fucking knows, of course, because no one understands Heidegger. But it's like that must blow the minds of academics to be even given that question. You know what I mean? Like, that's just not a question that was ever proposed to me in the philosophy department at the university I was at.
Well, this has been for many of my colleagues quite a very strange thing that what I'm doing, this philosophy of breathing. And jokingly, one of my colleagues asked me once when we were having a dinner, he asked, why are you doing this thing? Why you could also doing a philosophy of farting?
Wow.
So even if that's a joke, normally jokes tell something truth in them. So that you can't like make okay, both is kind of passing gas in a certain way, from the other from the mouth and some from the other from behind. But the thing is like that, okay, there is a huge difference between farting and breathing.
It's a way of belittling the body. You know, I had a friend of mine who was actually an anthropologist at university, and he just said, look, my body just carries my head from one lecture to the next, you know. And this was a guy who had like physical health problems by the age of 30. I was like, dude, maybe there's a reason why you're having physical health problems. You're only 30 years old and you're having all these health conditions, and it's like you just view your body as this sort of brain taxi servant of yours. It just like, come on, dude. Like, and he'd been really bought into the whole academic model, and his health was really suffering as far as I could see.